Hello, high-tech marketers. This is Jackie, and I'm recording the Chapter 7 podcast for you. Chapter 7 is all about the customer perspective in high-tech marketing. And one thing you're hearing is that that is just critically important to successful high-tech marketing. The topics in this chapter that are covered are shown here on this opening slide, and we'll only do a fraction of these for class. The first thing I'd like to review with you are the factors that affect the adoption and diffusion of innovation. You should remember from your Principles of Marketing class that one of the most important theories in marketing is Everett Rogers' adoption and diffusion of innovation, which essentially divides the market into categories of customers based on their likelihood or propensity to adopt innovations. And those range from innovators to early adopters to early majority to late majority to laggards. Excuse me. And the factors that affect how quickly a new innovation diffuses through society are listed on this chart. I would like you to review these factors on your own. They are critically important in explaining the customer's perspective in evaluating a new technology. And they're so important that I have starred complexity here so that you review the research in the book that discusses complexity as a particular factor that affects customer adoption of new technologies. And finally, I would like to direct your attention to a blog post that I wrote on a website called Wisepreneur, Wisepreneur, that essentially predicts several years ago how likely it would be for QR codes to be diffused into the business arena. So these are very helpful factors just to do a cursory overview of what are going to be the barriers that this new technology will face. And I'll ask you to do a hands-on example in class. From a technology marketing perspective, the categories of adopters from Everett Rogers' model have been modified for the technology environment. This modification was done by Geoffrey Moore, Geoffrey. Moore is Moore, who we introduced in Chapter 1 as the author of the FUD factor. Excuse me, the name of his book is actually Crossing the Chasm, but the topic we discussed in Chapter 1 was fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that comes from his book. What you'll see is that he has renamed the categories of adopters in the language of technology industry. The innovators are now the enthusiasts who eagerly embrace technology. Sometimes these folks are called gadget freaks because they like to own those new gadgets first. And these are the people for consumer electronics who might wait in line overnight to get the first new generation of, the Xbox or a new game. What I would like you to do is to look very carefully at the descriptions of each of these categories of adopters on your own, because the characteristics of these adopters have very different marketing implications based on what their concerns are about adopting technology. As you'll see here, Geoffrey Moore's adaptation to the adoption and diffusion theory includes not only relabeling the names of these categories, but you'll also see that there is a big gap between the visionaries and pragmatists rather than a normal diffusion through each category along the bell-shaped curve. Geoffrey Moore labels this gap the chasm, and essentially the basis of his adaptation to Everett Rogers' theory, is that new technologies often see some early success in the market simply because technology enthusiasts and visionaries are willing to overlook some of the flaws in either the technology, the marketing of the technology, or the incomplete ecosystem behind the technology. And when these technologies fall into the chasm, it's very, very difficult for them to make the leap to success in the pragmatist market. And the beauty of Geoffrey Moore's theory is that he essentially offers a recipe of sorts for companies to not only avoid falling in the chasm, but to cross the chasm. As we go through each of these categories, what I'm going to do is highlight for you what I think the most important characteristics are, and you can read the other characteristics on your own. These technology enthusiasts are so eager to embrace new technology that they're willing to overlook some of the initial bugs that this technology may have. It may not be perfect, and in fact, when they find a flaw, a technical flaw in a new product, it actually makes them feel smart, and when they find that, they actually want to call up the engineer or the designer on the project and view that designer as a peer. And so these folks are not very typical. They're willing to accept these glitches and the lack of an ecosystem, and they'll build out their ecosystem on their own. These are people who might modify or adapt technologies for their own purposes. These are not typical customers, and in fact, oftentimes they don't want to pay a lot for the new technology in exchange for being a beta tester. The next category of adopters are the visionaries. And when you even think of this word visionary, what you think of somebody is a person who's very forward-looking and can make decisions today that set them up for success in the future. And this is no different for customers of technology products. Visionaries typically are business people from a business-to-business marketing sense who want to buy technology to radically change the competitive rules in their industry. They want to compete under a new business model. These are the Jeff Bezos of the world who are going to build huge warehouses in Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada in the 1999s before e-commerce is even a viable solution. Visionaries are attracted by high-risk, high-reward projects, and they're not necessarily price-sensitive, which means they're willing to pay for their technology. But the flip side is they really want technology customized to their particular needs. Now, these characteristics of product form competition and communicating horizontally, these are important characteristics, and I would like you to read about them on your own in the book. Let's contrast those visionaries to pragmatic customers. The word pragmatic means practical, and at some level it's the exact opposite of a visionary. Pragmatists don't want revolutionary change. They want evolutionary incremental improvements in their business practice. They are risk averse. They don't want to disrupt their operations by having an unproven technology. They want proven applications. And the real difficulty in selling to pragmatist customers from a technology perspective is they want to wait and see. They only are willing to buy new technologies, breakthrough technologies, when somebody else in their industry already has adopted that technology and has a successful case study for them to refer to. So from a vendor perspective, how do you get a pragmatist to adopt when they'll only adopt if another pragmatist has already adopted? So it's a real catch-22 situation. Conservatives on a continuum are more risk-averse than pragmatists. They are extremely price-sensitive. They don't want any risks, and they need the whole ecosystem in place before they buy. And really, when they buy, their motivation is to keep up with their competitors. and they like to rely on trusted advisors to do this. So oftentimes they might go through a consultant rather than buy on their own or through a vendor. And Geoffrey Moore refers to the laggards as the Flat Earth Society of Technology, and this word flat earth comes before Thomas Friedman, the world is flat. Flat earth in the 1400s essentially were the people who thought Christopher Columbus was going to fall off the edge of the world because the earth was flat. So they're very risk averse and they're behind the times. Luddites is another word for the Flat Earth Society. Luddites were people who actually burned, I think it was knitting looms in England in the medieval ages because they thought that the mechanization of knitting essentially was going to erode society. So you see that these people really, they view technology as a hindrance and they'd like to avoid it at all purposes. So the implication of these categories of adopters and their unique characteristics is what sets up this idea of the chasm. And the chasm is this gap between the visionaries and the pragmatists. And from a business perspective, what we know empirically is that the chasm in fact does exist. And one of the reasons for this is because the marketing that worked for the visionaries in terms of revolutionary change actually turns pragmatists off. And if visionaries adopt technology, they're considered risky, scary people, and so they're not credible references for pragmatists. Another issue here, oftentimes in terms of the presence of this gap, is that companies don't understand, because they're technology companies, what this pragmatic mindset is like. So it's very difficult for them to communicate with pragmatists. And in fact, this problem in communication, the breakdown in word-of-mouth communication, in the diffusion of the innovation, is one of the key reasons for the presence of the chasm as empirically validated in 2 Journal of Marketing articles. So let's look at these differences a little more specifically. When you look at the visionary characteristics and the pragmatist characteristics, you can see why the word of mouth breaks down and that pragmatists are not willing to look at visionaries as being a credible reference. The fact that pragmatists are pedestrian, the word pedestrian essentially means boring and dull. So what does this mean for high-tech marketing? What this means for high-tech marketing is that the marketing strategy to the visionaries is something that high-tech firms inherently understand. It's an exciting time. They want to push their product out to market, even if it's a little bit early. Their goal is to establish a first-mover advantage in the marketplace. And engineers are just thrilled because they're finally getting some validation of how brilliant they are. And they really want to focus on this best possible solution. And if we think back to chapter 3 with the idea of expeditionary marketing and kind of mini experiments in the market, this kind of is the exact opposite because they really want to do a moonshot here. They want to shoot for the moon. But then what ends up happening is there are only so many visionaries in a market, and in fact there are only 12.5% of the possible revenue in the market. And as this market becomes saturated, the firm actually experiences either a decline in revenue growth or in fact, a decline in the rate of growth or an actual decline in revenue. And what happens is some of the key leaders in the company become disillusioned, there may be quite a bit of turnover, and venture capitalists in particular are unwilling to continue putting in additional rounds of funding. So the solution then is to look to Geoffrey Moore's ideas about how do we actually cross the chasm. And before we move on to crossing the chasm, I think what I'll do is I'll insert a joke for you today. So the interviewer asks the interviewee, what is one of her major weaknesses? And the interviewee responds, well, it's probably my honesty. And the interviewer says, I don't think honesty is a weakness. Could you please explain? And the interviewee says, really? I don't give a damn what you think. Okay, end of recording.